Hi, I'm Lori Grunin, Senior Editor for CNET, and this is the Canon PowerShot G12. The G12, which is targeted at enthusiasts, is practically identical to its predecessor, the G11. Like the G11, the G12 keeps highlights like its relatively large 10 megapixel 1/1.7 inch CCD and the nice 2.8 inch articulating LCD. And it also adds a few updates like 720 24p video capture, which was a much needed boost over the outdated VGA movies. And it also has stereo audio and a mini HDMI connector. Like its line mate, the S95, the G12 also adds an HDR scene mode that combines 3 shots. Unlike other implementations that take advantage of fast BSI sensors, though, this HDR requires the steadiness of a tripod, which makes it less useful. Though only a few ounces lighter than the G11, the G12 does remain the heaviest camera in its class. It's not the biggest, though. That nod goes to the P7000 from Nikon. It also has an almost identical design to the G11, which includes a usable optical viewfinder and large, easy-to-turn dials for exposure compensation and ISO sensitivity. The mode dial offers the typical manual exposure and auto exposure options, as well as 2 custom setting slots and some scene program modes. It's got a relatively functional design, and I like it except for a few caveats. In addition to giving the camera the retro feel, the dials on the G12 are for the most part practical and faster to use than even direct access buttons, because those always require at least some navigation. But I've been complaining about the G-series controller for the past 3 generations, so let's make it 4. I love the scroll wheel, but I find I tend to accidentally hit one of the switches when I'm trying to press the middle button. As for the wheel, I frequently press one of the switches while I'm scrolling as well. It's especially difficult to control in cold weather with numb fingers. You can assign a function to the programmable shortcut key on the upper right, though it limits your choices to options that don't already have existing direct controls. Finally, there's an adjustment dial on the front below the shutter button. I'm not crazy about the location because in a camera of this size, it doesn't fall naturally under any of your fingers. And I'm a big fan of digital levels in cameras, and the G12's implementation is one of the more usable ones. When you hit the level area, the white indicator turns green and expands a bit, making it easy to see so you don't overshoot. Aside from that, the feature set is pretty typical for this type of camera. As you'd expect, the G12's image quality mirrors that of the G11's as well. It looks great at the lowest ISO sensitivities with excellent color and exposure. You start to see a slight bit of detail degradation starting at ISO 200 if you have good eyes, and that becomes more overt, along with noisier, at ISO 400. ISO 800 is probably the highest usable setting under the most forgiving of circumstances. Unlike the Panasonic LX5, processing the G12's files as RAW doesn't really deliver an unambiguous advantage over its JPEGs. The artifacts and colors are a bit different, and you might be able to gain a little sharpness from the RAW, but it doesn't gain you any shooting exposure advantages. The G12 lens is quite sharp. Though it's not terrible, the G12 does display visible barrel distortion at its widest of 28 millimeters, as well as a bit of fringing on high contrast edges, especially close to the edges of the frame. Unsurprisingly, the video looks better than the old VGA offering, and overall it's pretty good for shooting short clips. It's certainly worth it compared to a typical mini camcorder. Plus, the articulated LCD stereo mic and mic jack add to its video flexibility. But it lacks the ability to zoom while recording, and there aren't any manual exposure controls save exposure compensation and the built-in neutral density filter. The G-series' unremarkable performance hasn't changed significantly in generations either, and the field in general still lags behind the LX5. Especially if you're used to shooting with a DSLR, the G12 doesn't feel very fast, but part of that's perception. The Canon PowerShot G12 remains a generally excellent camera that ends up lagging the LX5 overall, mostly because of its relatively unchanged and more sluggish shot-to-shot performance. It delivers better JPEG photos than that model, but it's also less compact. Trade-offs abound. I'm Lori Grunin, and this is the Canon PowerShot G12.